It's said that those who seek out power are often the ones least suited to wield it, their desire for authority a seeming flaw in their character that makes them ineffective as leaders. The corollary to this position, then, is that power, and certainly absolute power, can only be bestowed upon those who don't necessarily want it. A decades-long revolving door of emperors in the 3rd century who rose to power through violent means only to govern ineffectively before they too were ironically struck down by a usurper would support the idea that monomaniacal ambition of this sort has a corrosive effect on the body politic. But before we consider this an open and shut case, we should reflect on the life and career of the Emperor Decius, a man who, according to official accounts, did not want the throne, but had the responsibilities quite literally thrust upon him. However, despite rising to power in this manner, his reign proved no more effective at arresting Roman decline than his predecessors had been, and worse yet, his eventual death in 251 would be a moment of such profound humiliation and shame for Rome that it represented a new low point for the empire after decades of crisis. A society that had comforted themselves with the idea that at least it couldn't get any worse was now forced to reckon with the fact that it actually could get worse, and perhaps that it inevitably would. The 3rd century was a time of unlikely emperors who took unprecedented paths to the throne, and Decius continued that tradition. His ascent began with an incursion into Roman territory by tribes along the Danube, a violation of Roman territory that was becoming increasingly routine along the empire's many fronts in this age of strife and disorder. Though these invaders were defeated, they were not defeated by a force commanded by Emperor Philip the Arab, meaning that the victorious general, a man named Pactantius, was acclaimed emperor by his legions. Though, fortunately for Philip, Pactantius's troops soon rethought their mutiny and murdered the man they had just elevated. Discontent was high, and another rebellion was clearly in the works among the elite Danube legions. Philip, being disturbed by these events, desired the Senate either to assist him against such imminent dangers, or, if they were displeased with his government, to suffer him to lay it down and dismiss him quietly. No person making a reply to this, Decius, a person of illustrious birth and rank, and moreover gifted with every virtue, observed that he was unwise in being so much concerned at those events, for they would vanish of themselves, and could not possibly long subsist. And, though the event corresponded with the conjecture of Decius, which long experience in the world had enabled him to make, yet Philip was still in fear, knowing how obnoxious the officers in that country were to the army. He therefore desired Decius to assume the command of the legions in Moesia and Pannonia. As he refused this under the plea that it was inconvenient both for Philip and himself, Philip made use of the rhetoric of necessity, and compelled him to go to Pannonia to punish the accomplices. The army in that country, finding that Decius punished all that had offended, thought it most politic to avoid the present danger, and to set up a sovereign who would better consult the good of the state, and who, being more expert both in civil and military affairs, might without difficulty conquer Philip. For this purpose they clothed Decius in purple, and, notwithstanding all his apprehensions of future mischances, compelled him to assume the supreme authority. Philip, therefore, on hearing that Decius was thus made emperor, collected all his forces to overpower him. The supporters of Decius, though they knew that the enemy had greatly the advantage in numbers, still retained their confidence, trusting to the general skill and prudence of Decius in affairs. And when the two armies engaged, although the one was superior in number, yet the other so excelled it in discipline and conduct that a great number of Philip's partisans were slain, and he himself amongst them, together with his son, on whom he had conferred the title of Caesar. Decius thus acquired the empire. This is the official narrative relaying the rebellion of the Danube legions, the Battle of Verona, and Decius's rise to power in September 249. However, as is all too common in this era of disorder and uncertainty, we have reason to doubt the official version. For starters, the weakness of our sources, and a narrative that is so flattering to Decius, has led modern scholars to theorize that we are reading an approved version of history meant to justify Decius's ascent after the fact. For, as mentioned above, the story goes that he did not want imperial power, instead having it forced upon him. It fit well with the stoic, traditional disposition of Decius to show himself as a man who had risen to his position not through ambition or scheming, but by popular acclaim. In addition, despite Zosimus's account portraying Decius as a loyal subject to Philip, Decius had his predecessor's name condemned once he achieved power, damning his memory and striking him from monuments. It seems quite the about-turn in reverence for a man he supposedly had once loyally served. An additional piece of evidence for those positing that Decius's hands may not be clean is that he was from the very region where the rebellion took place. So there is suspicion that he may have angled for the job of being sent to quell the legions on the Danube himself so that he could lead these crack troops against Philip. But, though we will never know the true means by which Decius became emperor, it is clear that he stepped into the job ready to transform the ailing empire from day one. He signaled these ambitious goals by appending the name of the great emperor Trajan to his own, becoming Trajan Decius in all official communications. Well over a century after his death, Trajan was viewed as the optimo princeps, and the adoption of his name indicates that Decius sought to consciously embody the traditions and old ways that had brought Rome such success. For at this point, the reality of Roman decline was incontrovertible, and the limitations of Roman ideology meant it was difficult to imagine solving the empire's issues through innovation or any new thinking. Rather, Rome was shaped by inherent conservatism, and it was thus reasoned that the way out of a bad situation in the present was to return to what had worked in the past. In many ways, then, Decius seems a man who stood athwart history, yelling stop, developing a historical consciousness that placed him among a lineage of great rulers, and determined to arrest decline by reviving traditions that had been neglected. This is not mere modern psychoanalysis. Decius even minted coins of past deified emperors, including Augustus, Vespasian, Trajan, and Severus Alexander, in an attempt to not just associate himself with past virtues, but also to rewrite Roman history, by excluding certain divinized emperors, like Gordian III, that he deemed unworthy. The need to solidify his claim to the throne is apparent when we consider not just the dubious nature of his ascent, but also the many problems facing Rome, for which he needed widespread support from all key societal stakeholders if he was to address properly. The first of these was the threat posed by the Goths and the Carpi along the Danube frontier, a situation that was not helped by Decius removing troops from the front to wage his civil war with Philip. War with the Goths would both define Decius's reign and lead to its brutal end, a series of events we will discuss later. Also of note was the ongoing financial crisis, which was slowly unraveling the Roman economy, as the actual precious metal in coins became ever less tethered to their supposed face value. Here, Decius attempted several reforms, introducing a heavy double sestertius and a new, lower denomination, but these efforts never saw significant success, and were quickly abandoned after his reign. Decius's efforts to fix the empire's fiscal issues were undone by the poor grasp Romans had of fundamental economics. But in Africa a new danger lurked that was even less understood. For soon after Decius ascended to the throne, Rome was confronted by the emergence of an unprecedented plague that modern epidemiologists theorize may be related to Ebola. The disease wreaked a savage toll on the empire, claiming millions of lives, including eventually Decius's youngest son Hostilianus, and it only added to the sense of doom that pervaded the empire. An emperor knew how to confront a military threat like the Goths, and even had some threadbare idea about how to address economic woes, but, deprived of modern science, there was no hope of ending such a dreadful plague, and it is only natural that Romans from a wide range of theological backgrounds felt themselves under divine judgment. With Decius facing such unenviable circumstances, and seemingly only able to confront them through a backwards-looking conservative approach, it is little wonder that he was not long for the throne. But even Decius, at his most grim, could never have predicted the ignoble fate which awaited him, nor could he imagine the eternal infamy that would be associated with his name. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. For despite his short, lackluster reign, Decius is among the most famous Roman emperors of his era, due to his empire-wide persecution of the emerging Christian church. While in earlier days Christians had been subjected to sporadic local pogroms and legal penalties, these had varied in intensity according to local conditions, and were only rarely directed by the emperor himself. Decius, however, was the first to systematize persecution and make it universal. Although it seems likely that instead of trying to destroy the faith entirely, he simply wanted to bring this new set of divergent religious practices under the overarching framework of belief, cult, and ritual that had formed the basis of Roman social life for centuries, and was the ideological underpinning of the divine imperial cult that afforded him legitimacy. Surveying the pitiful state of affairs for the once great empire, Decius had come to what seemed to him and his peers a rather natural conclusion, that the decline in Roman fortunes was due to the lack of proper religious observance towards the state's patron gods. As easy as it is for us moderns to chide him for seeing an idealistic root cause of the disorder instead of perceiving the rot as a manifestation of material forces and societal contradictions, we must remember that to a Roman there was no line of separation between the secular and political spheres. The idea that improper devotion to the divine pantheon was any less real than monetary policy or military strategy would have been incomprehensible. Religion was not a separate phenomenon to daily existence that was experienced at certain times or places. Rather, it was axiomatic to existence, and the divine provided an unquestioned ground of being that served as an essential guarantor of the political and social structures required for Rome to operate. All of these interwoven aspects were simply parts of a unified whole, in a state and society animated by its pacts with the gods. This concept of a fundamental unity in all affairs was a core tenet of Roman ideology, and had been at the core of Philip's prioritization of the secular games of 248, as he sought to reaffirm Rome's commitments to its patron deities in an effort to deliver Rome from its struggles and inaugurate a new golden age. That this gambit clearly failed, and that Philip was dead not long after, was not a sign to the Romans that his approach was flawed. Even the emergence of that idea itself was nearly impossible. It simply meant that the rituals had not been conducted properly. To rectify this, Decius issued an edict requiring all inhabitants of the empire to offer prayers and sacrifices to the traditional gods, and to confirm that they had always made these sacrifices. The ambition of such a proposal is stunning. It is easy for us, looking at maps and retrojecting the unity of modern states onto the ancient world, to imagine the empire as a cohesive, singular entity. But this was far from the case. In reality, the empire and its 60 million inhabitants resided in a patchwork system of innumerable languages, customs, and beliefs, all loosely knit together by local cities that acted as the hubs of culture and governance in their regions. To attempt anything on a universal scale in this era was incredibly complex, and the clearest model we have for Decius's proclamation was Caracalla's grant of universal citizenship decades earlier. To celebrate this monumental occasion, unprecedented in the history of the empire, Decius received the title Restitutor Sacrorum, or Restorer of the Sacred Rites, an indication that while he certainly sought to legitimize his tenuous position and assert his unique relationship with the gods, there was a real organic belief in Roman society that the Pax Deorum was faltering. Decius must have felt that the problem with previous religious revivals, and the chief cause of their failure, is that they had been entirely voluntary, and thus some were allowed to omit themselves from the practice, indicating fractiousness within the Roman body that prevented the gods from showing their favor. To ensure that his sacrifices would be a truly universal rite, all who completed the ritual were given a written certificate, called a libellus, from local magistrates, providing evidence that they had duly honored the traditional gods. Severe consequences were to follow for all who were unwilling to do what was required to obtain this certificate, and the strong reaction of the Christian community against this decree, and the stronger Roman counter-reaction, ensured Decius's eternal infamy. Debate rages in the Academy over the degree to which Decius specifically targeted Christians with his order. While he was doubtlessly aware of this small religion's unwillingness to participate in traditional rites, he and his advisors were certainly baffled at this obstinate exclusivity. It must be noted that they had no problem with belief in the Christian God, or a unique reverence for Jesus. They simply wanted these religious impulses to be folded under the official umbrella of polytheist worship that acknowledged a multitude of gods and the unique place of the emperor, even if personally practitioners felt a special affinity for a single deity. That Christians refused to compromise on the irreconcilability between monotheism and polytheism was the problem, not the name of the god they worshipped. So, while there is a temptation to see Decius and his peers as more tolerant than the Christians, because of the relative openness of their religious perspective, this is simply a mirage. Decius was just as committed to the core tenets of his religious system that he considered non-negotiable as the most dogmatic Christian. The lines were drawn in different places, but each community had firm lines, and the subsequent behavior of Decius in his violent repression of those who refused to sacrifice should remind us that Roman polytheism was not intrinsically more tolerant than monotheistic creeds. It was all simply a question of the individual's expression of their own religious principles. So, in my estimation then, the question of Decius's fundamental intent is irrelevant. That the persecution of Christians was likely based more on the political, cultural, and theological dissonance between the Church and the polytheistic traditions of Roman social order, instead of outright malice or bigotry, does not erase the real harms it caused. I do not want to dwell too deeply on individual episodes of persecution, as they have been detailed in an earlier video, but it is worth stating that they were a horrific abuse of state power, and a near-existential crisis for the Christian community. Pope Fabian was executed, and leading figures targeted, like the intellectual Origen of Alexandria, who was imprisoned and tortured, but kept alive in a miserable state to prevent him from achieving the martyrdom that he desired. But while penalties for leadership had been a hallmark of early, more sporadic persecutions, this effort also succeeded in fully otherizing the Christians, marking them as social outcasts and acceptable targets of mob violence. Julian, a man who was unable to stand or walk, they brought him forward with 2 others who carried him. One of these immediately denied, but the other, whose name was Cronion, and whose surname was Unus, and the old man Julian himself, both of them, having confessed the Lord, were carried on camels throughout the entire city, which, as you know, is a very large one, and in this elevated position were beaten and finally burned in a fierce fire, surrounded by all the populace. But a soldier named Bessus, who stood by them as they were led away, rebuked those who insulted them, and they cried out against him, and this most manly warrior of God was arraigned, and, having done nobly in the great contest for piety, was beheaded. But it must be noted that not all partook in the persecutions, and many seem to have gone out of their way to shield Christians. For example, despite Eusebius's embellishments, there is no reason to suspect that Bessus was a Christian. He simply seems to be a man who felt that the brutality of the crowd was unwarranted, and there is evidence showing that local officials helped Christians obtain certificates without requiring them to make sacrifices. The sacrifices thus failed entirely in their effort to unify Roman society, for not only did the Christian Church clearly weather the storm, but even polytheists balked at the brutality that they were told was required to guarantee divine favor. But the chief cause of the edict's failure would prove to be its brevity, for it was only in effect for roughly 18 months. But this was not due to a change in heart from Decius. Instead, his dream of a Rome wholly united under the traditional pantheon would die with him. Historians can wonder how long a ruler as ill-fated as Decius would have managed to keep his tenuous hold on power, for even in his less than 2 years on the throne, usurpers had surfaced to make their own bids for the purple. This was naturally Decius's greatest fear. He had come to power this way, and knew that potential traitors lurked in every shadow. By this time, it was also regrettably the normal way of things, and certainly how Decius felt his reign was most likely to end, as a Roman undone by other Romans. But a cruel twist of fate awaited Decius. He would not meet his end at Roman hands, but would perish in a catastrophic military defeat, enduring the shame of becoming the first Roman emperor to die to a foreign foe. Another chapter in Rome's long struggle with the Danube tribes began in 250, shortly after Decius rose to the throne, and it was chiefly this crisis that was to dominate his attention during his reign. Naturally, Decius had to take personal command of the forces tasked with repelling the Gothic incursion, out of the fear that entrusting such a large and well-equipped army to anyone else would invite another rebellion. The emperor's record as a commander in this conflict was far from stellar, as the Gothic forces under their king Cniva continually eluded him, and the legions were limited to checking his movements and harassing his columns. Though they consistently had the upper hand initially, they were never able to secure a decisive victory. This limited success seems to have bred complacency and overconfidence, and the Romans would even be thoroughly outmatched at Beroe, walking into a trap set by the Goths and leading to the loss of the large and influential city of Philippopolis. But despite these setbacks, the Romans reformed, and in the summer of 251 pinned in the Gothic forces, who were slowed by the sheer number of prisoners and war booty they had to transport. The situation looked desperate for the Goths, and the Roman captives must have felt they were now to be spared the suffering and indignity of a life of slavery in the lands beyond the Danube. Knowing he could never cross before the Romans overtook him, Cniva then opted to make his last stand in a swamp near Arbitus, that he hoped would negate superior Roman arms, training, and tactics. Even still, he was not confident of victory, and offered to return his captives and treasure in exchange for safe passage back across the Danube. But this was a bargain that Decius could never accept. Had he allowed a barbarian to ravage the empire with impunity, he would have invited rebellion, and likely would never have made it back to Rome, as his troops were sure to mutiny if denied the ability to capture the Goths as their own slaves. A clash was inevitable, and Decius, full of hubris and a hunger for glory, trusted in the strength of his legion and the protection of the gods he had done so much to please. On the field that day, the Romans initially pushed the Goths back, and the foe seemed on the verge of breaking. Sensing a rout, Decius overcommitted his army into the emerging breach, personally leading the army from the front. This is exactly what Cniva had hoped for, and the Romans soon found themselves bogged down in deeper waters that made them sitting ducks for Gothic archery. It was a massacre unlike any Rome had seen since the Teutoburg Forest. Decius and his elder son, and co-Augustus Herennius Etruscus, were slain, and the defeat marked a new low point of imperial power and prestige. Previously bested only by unconventional tactics and in small-scale skirmishes, Rome had now been defeated on Roman soil, in a pitched battle, and even the emperor himself was now dead. Christian writers later saw this violent death as an act of divine retribution for his persecution, a just end for a man they deemed an enemy of God. In the battle that followed, they quickly pierced the son of Decius with an arrow and cruelly slew him. The father saw this, and although he is said to have exclaimed to cheer the hearts of his soldiers, "Let no one mourn, the death of one soldier is not a great loss to the Republic," he was yet unable to endure it, because of his love for his son. So he rode against the foe, demanding either death or vengeance, and when he came to Arbitus, a city of Moesia, he was himself cut off by the Goths and slain, thus making an end of his dominion and of his life. This place is today called the Altar of Decius, because he there offered strange sacrifices to idols before the battle. Decius, the emperor who believed himself an heir to Trajan, and had demanded universal sacrifice in his bid to solidify Rome's failing pact with its gods, had been slain on the altar of his own hubris. Ignorant as he was of the real material contradictions driving Roman decline and the implosion of its traditional ideology, Decius had known, with a grim and stoic, albeit entirely misplaced certainty, that all Rome needed to reverse its decline was a reclamation of its old traditions. But he was chasing ghosts, and would die the most shameful death of any emperor to date, slain by barbarians and abandoned by the deities he had served his whole life. He died in that swamp without ever suspecting that Rome was on the verge of retaliating against the continued impotence of its pantheon by turning its back on these very gods.